Welcome to Quicklit, your gateway to book wisdom.
Welcome back, everyone. We're doing a deep dive today into execution, the discipline of getting things done. It's by Larry Bossidy and Charan. It's all about, how come so many companies just can't seem to execute their strategies, even when they've got, the best plans and the smartest people working for them?
Well, it's like, having one of those fancy sports cars, but never shifting out of first gear.
Yeah.
I mean, all that power under the hood, but without good execution, you're just not going to get where you want to go.
That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, and not even just in business, can relate to that feeling, right? We all have these goals we want to achieve, these big dreams, but actually making them happen, well, that's a whole other story, isn't it? And what I found so interesting about this book, Bossidy and Charan don't just say execution is important. They actually give you a framework for figuring out what goes wrong and how to build that culture of execution.
Right. And right off the bat, they talk about this thing they call the gap nobody knows. It's like, the disconnect between what a company says it wants to do and what it can actually do.
They actually tell this story about a CEO. They call him Joe. And he seems like he's doing everything right. Top consultants, great team, solid plan. But then he gets fired. What happened?
He couldn't execute. Joe's problem, he just couldn't get that open and honest dialogue going with his team. Everyone was too afraid to say, hey, wait a minute, is this really going to work? Or what if this happens? So no one challenged his thinking, and, well, in the end, it cost him his job.
I think there's a lesson in there for all of us,
Yeah.
You just can't execute if you're not getting honest feedback and really listening to what people are saying. Speaking of that, what exactly do they mean by this robust dialogue? It sounds like it's more than just, having a chat.
Oh, yeah. It's about creating a culture where everyone feels safe to speak their mind, challenge the status quo, be willing to have those tough conversations about performance, resources, potential problems, all of that. It's not just talking for the sake of talking. It's about thinking critically as a team and solving problems together.
Okay, so that open dialogue, that's key. But what are some of the other things that trip companies up when it comes to execution?
Lack of accountability is a big one. If it's not crystal clear who's doing what and who's responsible for what, things just fall apart. Everyone starts pointing fingers, no one takes ownership, and, nothing gets done.
And that leads to another problem they talk about, not following through. You can have the most amazing plan, but if no one's actually putting in the work, tracking progress, and making adjustments along the way, it's all just talk.
You got it. The most brilliant plan in the world is worthless if no one is actually doing the work to make it happen.
They really hammer home the point that execution isn't just a one-time thing, some program you implement. It's this ongoing discipline, something that has to be woven into the very fabric of the company.
They use Compaq as an example, the computer company. They were doing incredibly well at first under CEO Eckhard Pfeiffer, growing like crazy, innovating, even challenging IBM for a while.
They seem to have a good strategy, so what happened?
Well, I think they just got swept up in all that growth and expansion, and their execution started to slip. They had trouble integrating the companies they were acquiring, and they weren't quick enough to adapt to how fast the tech world was changing. It's a good reminder that even when things are going well, you can't take your eye off the ball when it comes to execution.
And then you have Dell.
Yeah.
They were in the same industry, but really took off because they had this laser focus on execution. Their whole direct sales model, their obsession with efficiency, that's what gave them the edge.
Yeah, it's really a tale of two companies. Same industry, similar business models, but completely different outcomes because of execution or the lack of it.
Okay, so we've seen just how critical execution is and looked at some of the things that can go wrong. But where do you even begin to build a company that actually gets things done? What are the building blocks of an organization like that?
Well, it starts with leadership right at the top. We're not talking about CEOs who are just great speakers or have big ideas, though those things can help. We're talking about leaders who actually roll up their sleeves and make things happen. Leaders who are out there in the trenches, connecting with their teams, driving results.
They described a few key traits of these, I guess you'd call them, execution-focused leaders. And one that really stuck with me was how important it is to be present and connected to the people in the company. Bossidy, for example, he was known for visiting different locations all the time and having these really honest conversations with employees at every level.
Yeah, it's about getting out from behind your desk, really understanding what's happening out in the real world, not just relying on reports and presentations.
It kind of reminds me of another thing they talk about, insisting on realism in all those discussions and plans. Cutting through the BS and having those sometimes difficult conversations about what's actually possible. right?
Bossidy was famous for asking those tough questions, the ones that made people really think things through and back up their ideas with facts. He wanted to know what was really going on, not just what people thought he wanted to hear.
And he was really big on using a common language, making sure everyone understood the big goals and could talk about them clearly and be on the same page.
Exactly. You have to get rid of that ambiguity, right? Everyone needs to be crystal clear on what needs to be done and how you're going to measure success.
And this focus on clear communication, it goes hand in hand with setting clear goals and priorities. Bossidy says leaders need to focus their energy on a few really important things, not try to do everything at once.
Right. You can't do it all. You have to be strategic about where you focus your energy and resources.
It makes sense. You spread yourself too thin, something's going to fall through the cracks. What else can leaders do to build this kind of, execution-driven culture?
Well, you got to connect rewards to performance. It sounds obvious, right? But so many companies don't do this well. They don't make a distinction between their top performers and the people who are just coasting along, and that creates a culture where mediocrity is okay.
And that's definitely not what you want if you're aiming for a high-performance team.
No way.
Yeah.
And you can't forget about investing in your people's development. It's not enough to just hire the right folks. You got to give them the opportunity to grow, to learn new skills, to stretch themselves. You want to create a culture where people are constantly learning and getting better.
So we're starting to get this picture of what an execution-focused leader looks like. Present, connected, grounded in reality, setting clear goals, rewarding results, and investing in their people. But how do you take all that and actually shift an entire company's culture? That seems like a massive undertaking.
Now that's where things get really interesting. It's all about creating the right framework for change, and that's what we'll dig into next time.
Yet changing a company's culture, that's no easy task. But Bossidy and Charan, they lay out a really good framework for how to do it. And one of the big things they emphasize is being super clear about what you're moving away from and what you're trying to move towards. It's not enough to just say, oh, we need a better culture. You got to get specific, right? Like, what are those behaviors, those beliefs, those systems that are holding you back? And then what does that ideal future state actually look like?
They have this great phrase, from what to what, to really drive that point home. And they even give an example of the CEO who challenged her leadership team to come up with the specific cultural shifts they needed to, like really improve accountability. It's not just about talking about it, it's about getting down to the nitty-gritty. What does accountability actually look like day to day? What needs to change, and how are we going to measure if we're actually making progress? Yeah, you got to move beyond those vague ideas and really get into the details of how things are going to be different. And that leads to another key idea: building what they call a social operating system to support execution.
I got to admit, when I first read that, I thought they were talking about some kind of software or something. But it's actually a much broader concept, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's more about designing those communication channels, those structures for collaboration, and how information flows so that people can actually work together effectively and get stuff done. Think about it. You can have the right people, a great strategy, but if everyone's working in silos, hoarding information, and decisions are getting stuck in layers of bureaucracy, you're not going to execute very well.
So it's about creating that environment where everyone has access to the information they need, where they can work together easily, and decisions get made quickly and efficiently.
That's the idea. And you know what plays a huge role in this whole social operating system? You guessed it, that robust dialogue we were talking about earlier. It's about creating those spaces, whether it's meetings, informal chats, whatever, where people feel comfortable saying, hey, I'm not sure about that, or what if we tried this instead, and really challenging those assumptions.
It's pretty amazing how all these pieces fit together, right? You've got the leadership, the culture, and then this underlying system that kind of connects it all and makes it work.
It's kind of like building a house. You need a strong foundation, a well-designed structure, and then all those systems, electrical, plumbing, ventilation to make it livable.
Okay, so we've got the leadership, the culture, this operating system. But what about the people who are actually doing the work? Bossidy and Charan really stress the importance of getting the right people in the right jobs, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. And they're really adamant that you can't just delegate that whole process of selecting and developing leaders. It's something leaders have to be really hands-on with.
And they tell some pretty, I guess you could say, cautionary tales about what happens when leaders don't do this well. They talk about Joe, the CEO, who promoted someone who wasn't really qualified because he liked him, and Stan, who just couldn't bring himself to confront a guy who wasn't performing, and it really hurt the company.
Those stories really highlight how crucial it is to be willing to make tough decisions when it comes to people. It's not always easy, especially if you're dealing with someone you like or who's been with the company forever. But sometimes letting someone go or maybe moving them to a different role is the best thing for the organization in the long run.
It's about having that courage to put the company's needs ahead of personal feelings, which I know can be hard. And it's not just about firing people, it's about making sure you've got the right people and the right roles, giving honest feedback, and addressing those performance issues head on.
And it's about actually following through on those evaluations and development plans, not just going through the motions, but really investing in people's growth, giving them the support they need, and giving them chances to develop new skills.
So it's a much more, holistic approach to managing your talent, not just filling positions and hoping for the best.
You got it. It's about building a really strong, capable team that can actually execute on your strategy.
So you've got your awesome team in place, a rock-solid strategy. You've built this culture that supports execution. But how do you actually make it all happen? How do you take that strategy and put it into action?
That's where Bossidy and Charan introduce their 3 core processes of execution. They call them the people process, the strategy process, and the operations process. And they're really big on the idea that these processes have to work together, not in isolation.
Like gears in a machine, right?
Yeah.
Each one has to be working properly and meshing with the others.
Exactly. So let's start with the people process, which we've already talked about quite a bit. It's all about making sure your talent strategy is aligned with your overall goals for the business. That means choosing your people carefully, developing their skills, and making sure you have the right capabilities to execute on your plan.
They talk about those honest assessments of performance and potential, going beyond just the annual review, and really digging deep to understand what each person brings to the table.
And it means having those tough conversations. If you're not willing to talk about performance issues, you're never going to get the best out of your team.
And this ties back to that whole robust dialogue thing, right? It's about creating a culture where people can give and receive feedback openly without feeling like they're going to get in trouble.
Yeah, it's about that growth mindset, where people are encouraged to learn, to improve, and where they see constructive feedback as a way to get better, not as a personal attack.
So once you've got a good handle on your people's strengths and weaknesses, then it's about building that leadership pipeline, making sure you have people ready to step into key roles as they open up.
They talk about the idea of succession depth, having multiple people who could potentially fill a given role so you're not caught flat-footed if someone leaves or gets promoted.
Because you never know what's going to happen,
Right.
right? Someone decides to retire or move to a new company, you got to be prepared.
Exactly. Having those backup options is crucial so you don't lose momentum.
And they also talk about reducing that retention risk, figuring out who your key players are, the ones who might be tempted to leave, and doing what you can to keep them happy and engaged.
It's all about creating an environment where people feel valued, where they feel challenged, and where they feel like they're part of something important. And it's not just about salary. It's about creating that culture where people actually want to show up every day.
It's about building a place where people actually look forward to going to work.
Exactly. And when you get that people process right, executing your strategy becomes a whole lot easier because you've got the right people in the right spots, they're motivated, and they're ready to make things happen.
But having a great team is just one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
You got to have a solid strategy, and that's where the second core process comes in.
The strategy process, it's all about creating that clear, actionable plan that actually aligns with your big picture goals, something you can actually execute. It's not just about having a fancy vision. It's about making sure that vision is grounded in reality. Do you actually have the resources, the talent, the capabilities to make it happen?
They talk about really analyzing your industry, your competitors, and your own strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah.
And being honest about what you can't do, not trying to take on more than you can handle.
You got to be willing to say no, even to opportunities that look really tempting, if they don't fit with your overall strategy.
They also say it's critical to ask those really tough questions when you're developing your strategy, like, is this actually going to make money? Can we realistically pull this off with what we've got? And what are we assuming is true? And are those assumptions valid?
It's about challenging the status quo, being willing to poke holes in those ideas that everyone takes for granted, and making sure your plan is based on solid logic and a good understanding of the market and what you're capable of doing.
They give this great example of a failed strategy. AT&T trying to get into the cable business. They had this big plan. They wanted to bundle all these services together, get direct access to consumers. It was a big flop.
And one of the main reasons they failed, they didn't really test their assumptions. They thought way more people would want bundled services than actually did. They underestimated the costs, and they overestimated their own ability to, make the whole plan work.
It's a reminder that you can't get swept up in the hype. You got to do your homework and make sure your plan is actually viable.
Bossidy and Charan, they talk about having this reality filter, being able to cut through all the noise, all the distractions, all the wishful thinking, and just focus on what you can actually achieve.
And being humble enough to admit when you're wrong, to adjust your course, and to learn from those mistakes. They also talk about keeping your strategy simple, being able to explain it clearly and concisely so everyone understands it.
Remember that line. If you can't describe your strategy in 20 minutes, simply and in plain language, you don't have a plan. It's about getting rid of all the jargon and complexity, just getting to the heart of what you're trying to accomplish.
It's true. If you can't explain it simply, you probably don't really get it yourself.
And if you don't get it, how can you expect your team to execute on it?
Good point. So let's say you've got your great strategy, the right people, a culture that supports execution.
Mm-hmm.
How do you translate all that into action? How do you go from that big picture plan to actually making things happen?
And that's where the third core process comes in, the operations process. It's all about taking that high-level strategy and turning it into concrete plans with timelines, milestones, metrics, the whole 9 yards.
This is where the rubber really meets the road, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's about breaking those big, ambitious goals down into steps that people can actually tackle.
You got it. It's about creating those realistic budgets, making sure resources are being used effectively, and getting everyone on the same page in terms of priorities.
They talk about having those regular operating reviews to track progress, figure out what's working, what's not working, and make adjustments as needed.
And these reviews, they shouldn't just be about reporting on what's been done. It's a chance to have those robust dialogues, solve problems, and make decisions as a team.
They give this example of this manager who comes in with this really optimistic plan, talking about how they're going to increase earnings like crazy after a period of flat growth. And Bossidy, he just pushes him, asking him to explain how he's going to make that jump from where they are now to those big numbers.
And it forces the guy to really think through his assumptions and come up with some more creative solutions. In the end, he figures out how to increase profits in the short term by streamlining operations and selling off a part of the business they didn't really need, and that frees up resources to invest in that longer-term growth plan.
It's a perfect example of how asking those tough questions and demanding that everything is grounded in reality can lead to better outcomes.
And this is where that concept of synchronization becomes so important, making sure all your different departments are on the same page and working together effectively towards those shared goals.
They use this analogy of an engine where the pistons aren't firing in the right order. You're not going to get very far if your teams aren't in sync.
Exactly. The operations process is all about creating that smooth, synchronized flow across the entire organization. And you got to have those backup plans because, let's be honest, things don't always go according to plan, right? So if you have a system for identifying those potential risks and thinking through what you'll do if things go wrong, you're going to be a lot more resilient when those inevitable bumps in the road come along.
They also talk about follow-through, making sure that decisions actually get made, actions are taken, and people are held accountable. They tell this story about a company where sales are great, but their margins are way too low. So in their operating review, they identify a few things that need to be fixed, like improving customer service, getting shipments out on time, and streamlining their supply chain.
And Bossidy, at the end of the meeting, he doesn't just say, okay, good talk, everybody, let's get to work. He sends out this detailed memo summarizing everything they agreed on, who's responsible for what, and the deadlines.
It's a good way to make sure everyone's on the same page and there's no confusion about who's doing what.
It's about creating that clear connection between the plan and what people are actually doing day to day. And they really stress the importance of regular reviews, not just once a year or even once a quarter, maybe even monthly or weekly, depending on the nature of the work.
They actually use Honeywell's response to 9/11 as an example of this. The airline industry was in total crisis, and Honeywell had to quickly reassess their whole plan for their aerospace division, which was a big part of their business.
And they were able to do that because they had this really strong operations process in place with good communication, strong data, and the ability to adapt to all that crazy change. They ended up making some really tough choices, laying off some people, cutting costs, and adjusting their revenue projections.
It was a tough time, but they were able to weather the storm because they had those systems in place. It's a pretty powerful example of how important it is to have a well-defined and well-executed operations process.
It's about having the right systems and structures to translate your strategy into action, to keep track of your progress, and to make changes as needed. But all of this is only as good as the people who are running it.
Which brings us back to that idea of leadership and that culture of execution we were talking about.
It's about leaders setting the tone, showing people how it's done, and holding themselves and everyone else accountable for results. But there's one more element that we need to talk about, and that's the leader's role in building a culture of constructive dissent.
That sounds kind of contradictory, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How can you have dissent in a culture that's all about execution? Doesn't that just create conflict and slow things down?
That's a really common misconception. But Bossidy and Charan actually argue that this kind of constructive dissent is essential for good execution. If everyone is just following orders blindly and nobody is willing to question assumptions or offer a different point of view, you're going to miss out on valuable insights and might even make some really big mistakes.
So it's about building that environment where people feel comfortable speaking up, even if what they have to say isn't popular or goes against what everyone else thinks.
Exactly. And as we move into the last part of our deep dive, we'll talk about how leaders can actually create that kind of environment and why it's so critical for achieving real execution excellence. So how do you actually build that kind of environment where people feel comfortable disagreeing? It can't be as easy as just saying, hey, it's okay to disagree with me.
Yeah, there's got to be more to it than that, right? It has to be something you really work at.
Exactly. It takes a real conscious effort from the leader to create that kind of open exchange.
Bossidy and Charan talk about leading by example. You want your team to be honest and open. You got to be honest and open yourself.
Right. You got to walk the walk. So being willing to admit when you're wrong, being open to changing your mind if someone presents a better idea, actively asking for feedback, even if it's not all sunshine and roses, you know?
And it's not just about what you say. It's about how you listen.
Oh, yeah. That's huge. A leader who really values dissent, they're going to be a good listener. They're going to really consider those other viewpoints, not just dismiss ideas that are different from their own.
They also need to be aware of all those different communication styles. Not everyone is comfortable speaking up in a big group. Some people are more introverted. Some people need time to think things through before they share their thoughts. Some people might feel more comfortable putting things in writing.
A good leader is going to recognize that and create different ways for people to share their ideas, whether it's one-on-one chats, smaller groups, maybe online tools, even anonymous feedback, if that's what it takes.
It's about making sure everyone has a way to be heard and feels comfortable speaking up. Bossidy and Charan also talk about how important it is to frame dissent as a good thing.
Yeah, instead of seeing it as a challenge or a sign of disrespect, you want to see it as a valuable part of the decision-making process.
It's about creating that culture where people can ask those hard questions, challenge assumptions, propose different solutions, all without worrying about getting punished or ridiculed for it.
Because a lot of times it's those conversations, the ones that make people a little uncomfortable, the ones where people are willing to push back a bit, those are the ones that lead to the best ideas and the most innovative solutions.
That makes sense. If everyone's always agreeing with each other, you're probably not thinking creatively enough. You need that little bit of friction to spark those new ideas.
Exactly. But it's also important to set some ground rules for how people should express those disagreements.
So it's not like a free-for-all, everyone just shouting at each other.
No, it should be structured. You focus on the issues, use data to back up your arguments, and you stay respectful and professional, disagreeing without being disagreeable, right?
And it's about that disagree and commit idea. Once a decision is made, everyone has to get behind it and support it, even if they didn't agree with it initially.
You got to have that healthy debate, explore the options, and then come together as a team to execute on the plan, whatever it is.
And the leader plays a big role in this whole process.
Right. They have to be able to sum up the discussion, explain what the decision is, why they made it, and make sure everyone knows what their role is going forward.
Got to bring that sense of closure to the discussion and then move on to the action phase.
By creating that culture where constructive dissent is valued, leaders can really tap into the collective wisdom of their team. Make better decisions and get better results. It's a really powerful way to drive innovation, improve problem solving, and just make the whole organization work better.
This has been such a great deep dive into the world of execution. We've covered a lot, haven't we? The importance of leadership, that culture of execution, how to build a strong team, those 3 core processes, and this whole idea of constructive dissent.
And I think the biggest takeaway is this. Execution is not just about systems or processes, it's about people. It's about creating that environment where people are empowered to get things done, where they feel like they can speak up, and where they're held accountable.
And it all starts with leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Leaders who can paint that clear vision, build a strong team, create a culture of accountability, and make sure everyone is communicating openly and honestly.
Bossidy and Charan, they've really stressed this. Execution is a discipline. It's something you have to constantly work at, refining your skills, improving your processes, and always remembering how important it is to get stuff done.
They end the book with this letter to a new leader. It's full of great advice, really encouraging. They talk about how leadership is a journey, not a destination, and how even the most experienced leaders are always learning and growing.
They give some really practical tips on building relationships, earning trust, creating accountability, and just dealing with all the challenges of leadership in a world that's changing all the time.
As you think about what we've talked about today, I'd encourage you to pick one area, just one, where you can get better at execution, whether it's in your work or your personal life.
What's one small step you can take today to close that gap between what you want to achieve and what you actually accomplish? Maybe it's having that tough conversation you've been putting off, or setting aside some time for planning, or maybe just creating a system for tracking your progress on those big goals.
Whatever it is, remember, execution is a discipline. It takes effort, focus, and a commitment to always getting better. But the payoff is huge.
Because when you master execution, you can make those dreams a reality.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into execution. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into a topic that'll help you learn, grow, and achieve even bigger and better things.
Thank you for being part of the Quicklit community. Please subscribe for get more videos like this.